The gravel crunched under the tires of the rusty old Jeep as it wound its way up the narrow mountain road. Tall pines stood like sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the early evening breeze. An oppressive sense of isolation settled in as Emma and her younger brother, Jake, finally caught sight of the cabin that was now theirs. "I can't believe we actually inherited this place," Jake said, peering up at the darkened windows of the old structure. "It looks like something out of a horror movie." Emma shot him a sidelong glance, her mouth twisting into a half-smile. "Stop it, Jake. It's just a cabin. Uncle Robert left it to us because he thought we'd appreciate it." Jake shrugged, but Emma could see the flicker of unease in his eyes. As they stepped out of the car, the cool mountain air filled their lungs. The scent of pine and earth was strong, almost overwhelming. The cabin itself was a 2-story structure, its wood weathered and gray, standing stubbornly against the encroaching forest. It looked ancient, like it had 1,000 stories to tell, each one darker than the last. They hauled their bags inside, the door creaking ominously as they pushed it open. Dust motes danced in the slivers of fading sunlight that pierced the gloom through the grime-covered windows. The interior was surprisingly well furnished, with sturdy wooden furniture and a massive stone fireplace that dominated the living room. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, evidence that no one had been here for a long time. Jake dropped his bag on the floor with a thud, sending up a small cloud of dust. "Let's get this place cleaned up," he said, trying to sound enthusiastic. They spent the next few hours sweeping, dusting, and airing out the cabin. As night fell, they lit a fire in the hearth, the warm glow casting flickering shadows on the walls. Emma and Jake sat on the old leather couch, sipping cocoa and staring into the flames. "You know," Emma began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I heard Uncle Robert mention something about this place being haunted." Jake snorted. "Come on, Emma. You don't believe in that stuff, do you?" Emma shrugged, not entirely convinced herself. "I don't know. He said something about a former resident who died here under mysterious circumstances." Before Jake could respond, a sudden, sharp knock echoed through the cabin, startling them both. They exchanged a glance, and Emma got up to open the door. There was no one there, just the empty porch and the dark forest beyond. "Probably just the wind," Jake said, though his voice wavered slightly. They tried to shake off the unease, but the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. The shadows seemed darker, the silence heavier. As they settled back on the couch, a low, almost imperceptible whisper filled the room, sending chills down their spines. "Did you hear that?" Emma asked, her eyes wide. Jake nodded, his face pale. "Yeah. What was that?" They both listened intently, but the whispering had stopped. Just the crackle of the fire and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. Trying to brush off their fear, they decided to call it a night and headed upstairs to their rooms. Emma lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that they were not alone. She thought about Uncle Robert, about what he might have known, but never told them. Exhaustion eventually claimed her, and she drifted into a restless sleep. She awoke to a cold, icy grip on her ankle. Gasping, she jerked her foot away and sat up, heart pounding. The room was dark, the only light a faint glow from the moon filtering through the curtains. There was no one there. She tried to tell herself it was just a dream, but she could still feel the lingering cold on her skin. Down the hall, Jake was having his own nightmare. He saw a figure, shadowy and indistinct, standing at the foot of his bed. It whispered his name, a chilling sound that seemed to echo from deep within the walls. He woke with a start, drenched in sweat, the whispering still echoing in his ears. Morning brought little relief. They sat at the kitchen table, bleary-eyed and anxious. "Something's wrong here, Emma," Jake said. "We need to find out what happened in this cabin." Emma nodded, determined. "Let's go into town and see if we can dig up any information." The local library was small and quaint, a relic of a bygone era. They pored over old newspapers and records, piecing together a story that sent shivers down their spines. Years ago, a man named Elias Granger had lived in the cabin. He was a recluse, rarely seen in town. One winter, a severe snowstorm hit the area, cutting off the cabin from the outside world for weeks. When the storm finally passed, locals went to check on Elias. They found him dead, sitting in his armchair by the fire, There were no signs of violence, no clear cause of death, just a look of sheer terror frozen on his face. Rumors spread that Elias had been haunted by a vengeful spirit, a woman who had died tragically in the mountains. Her restless soul had driven him mad, tormenting him until his heart gave out. As Emma and Jake read the accounts, they felt a cold dread settle over them. They returned to the cabin, the weight of Elias's story hanging heavy in the air. That night, the atmosphere in the cabin was tense. The fire crackled in the hearth, but it did little to dispel the chill that seemed to seep from the very walls. They sat in silence, listening to the wind howling outside. Suddenly, the temperature dropped sharply. Their breaths fogged the air, and an oppressive silence fell. The whispering began again, louder this time, filling the room with a sense of malevolence. Emma stood, her voice shaking. "Elias, is that you?" The whispering ceased, replaced by a low guttural growl. The cabin seemed to tremble, the shadows deepening. The figure appeared again, more distinct this time. It was Elias, or what was left of him. His eyes were hollow, his face twisted in an expression of unimaginable fear. "Leave this place," he hissed, his voice echoing with the sound of countless lost souls. "She will never let you go." Jake grabbed Emma's arm. "We need to get out of here. Now." They bolted for the door, but it slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows. The growl grew louder, more feral. The room darkened, the shadows coalescing into the form of a woman, her eyes burning with an unholy fire. "You cannot escape," she intoned, her voice echoing with centuries of suffering. "You will suffer as he did." Emma and Jake backed away, terror gripping their hearts. They stumbled into the kitchen, the oppressive presence following them. In a desperate bid, Emma grabbed a cast-iron skillet and swung it at the apparition. It passed through her, but the force of the swing sent Emma crashing into the counter. The skillet clattered to the floor, the noise deafening in the tense silence. Suddenly, the cabin door burst open, the wind howling inside. The woman's form wavered, her eyes narrowing with rage. "You cannot defy me," she screamed, her voice a cacophony of agony. Jake grabbed Emma's hand, pulling her towards the open door. They ran into the night, the freezing air biting at their skin. The cabin seemed to pulse with an unnatural light, the whispers following them into the forest. They didn't stop running until they reached the Jeep. Jake fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. The engine roared to life, and they sped down the mountain, the cabin shrinking into the distance. As they drove, Emma glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin was just a dark speck now, but she could still see the woman's fiery eyes watching them, burning with an eternal hatred. They never went back to the cabin. They tried to forget, but the memories lingered like a dark shadow, always just out of sight. They knew the spirit of the mountain would never rest, her torment a constant reminder of the horrors that lurk in the forgotten corners of the world.